Thank you for joining me in this tutorial regarding principles of piano accompaniment. I'm very excited to share my experience of playing with other musicians with you. The piano is larger and therefore louder than most of the instruments that it often accompanies. Even the simplest writing will equate to two other instruments since each hand plays an individual part. And often there would be 3 to 4 lines happening simultaneously. The more of these lines and notes that occur within a certain time frame, the more they accumulate volume. Therefore, it is often important to cut your volume back between 10 and 50% to avoid an ensemble conflict.
These percentages can vary based on texture, timbral distinction, range, or even the style of the music that you're playing. If you're not familiar with these terms, I suggest taking a brief moment to pause and read my definitions that are tailored to the needs of this video. Your soloist will often play on the loudest end of their dynamic range in concerto work since they have prepared it for a full orchestra in the long run. You can be on the higher end of your dynamics as well to give them a more authentic experience in this collaboration. In instrumental sonatas, however, many composers put the most important musical material in the solo part. Pianists usually need to take a backseat approach in these cases by cutting down dynamic levels significantly. Each instrumental group produces a unique timbre and level of sound that requires you to adjust your approach accordingly. Woodwinds are generally quieter and need the most breathing room for them to shine. Pianists should hold back the most while accompanying them. Strings have a large range, but they center around medium-level dynamics. Brass also have a great amount of variety, but often end up in the mezzo forte or above dynamic range, which gives a pianist more room to project than any other instrument group. Range is also an important factor. Lower pitches vibrate slower, so they are harder for the ear to lock into. Thus, they will get swallowed up by a loud or thick-textured pianist. High pitches function the opposite, so the pianist can afford to give a little bit more support underneath. Playing with a double bass requires cleaner pedaling and lower dynamic levels, whereas accompanying a piccolo or high-ranged flute requires more sonority accumulated by thicker pedals and louder dynamics.
The piano lid orientation can also help with balance issues. The short stick is best in most situations like I have here, since this allows the pianist to have the most amount of dynamic range without having to worry about covering up the soloist. A couple of exceptions will be included in the next chart.
It's best to use a full stick with brass players or percussionists since they both produce louder sounds and sharper timbres that cut through more than any other instrumentalists or singers. You may have to close the lid altogether when you encounter an unusually bright or tinny sounding piano, because failing to do so will almost always get in the way of your soloist due to timbral reasons. Lastly, it's always important to adjust to the room that you're playing in and the piano that you're playing on. A recording booth, for example, will most likely require a closed lid, whereas a 2,000-seat hall may need a full stick since you need to project to the entire space, and your soloist will likely be amplified.
The pitch distance between the piano and the solo part can influence the overall dynamic of the whole ensemble. Listeners can easily distinguish between the piano and another instrument when they're far apart in range. However, when the pitches are in close proximity, all issues of balance need to be exaggerated in order to be effective.
Beethoven's Spring Violin Sonata is a great example of this. The piano's right hand is 2 octaves under the violin part at the beginning. However, by measure 3, it's playing in the exact same range as you can see with the vertical lines I've drawn. I have then suggested that the piano drops down to pianissimo dynamic range in order to not cover up the tune. However, in measures 5 and 6, the piano needs to crescendo because the violin is going into a range that is not only in less conflict with the piano part, but also requires a bigger dynamic support. By measure 11, the parts flip, where the right hand of the piano is doing what the violinist did originally. The musical solution is the same, just vice versa. I will now demonstrate this by playing every part on the piano. Since I don't play any other instruments, I have formatted every example in the rest of the tutorial this way.
Relative to the indicated dynamic level at any given moment. Each layer of your ensemble should have its own volume level in order to demonstrate a more compelling musical texture. Personally, I have found that the following 4 questions have helped to aid my interpretive musical decision-making.
Who has the primary melody? Who is carrying the harmonic support? Who is supporting the melody with doubling, harmonization, or a counter melody? And finally, who is supplying the harmonic color? By filling it out in figurations, marking chordal changes, or carrying the momentum forward. If you answered pianist to any of these questions, also decide whether it's the left hand or the right hand functioning that way, since the hands are often working independently of each other and would count as separate parts.
These questions help because both melodic content and harmonic rhythm always take precedence within any musical texture. All other lines should be considered secondary, dynamically and timbrally. When 2 instruments double each other in the same octave, it's necessary for one of them to play 2 dynamic levels quieter in order to give the other one room to shine. Unless the composer has specifically notated a louder part in the accompaniment, the soloist is generally the one to take the lead. If they're exactly the same dynamic, I have presented a few solutions in the next chart.
When a pianist and a singer both have a melody marked mezzo forte, it's good for the vocalist to sing forte while the accompanist plays mezzo forte, or for the vocalist to keep the mezzo forte dynamic while the pianist drops to mezzo piano. In either case, it's the balance between the parts that allows the lead line to become prominent. Since there are multiple valid solutions to this problem, the players need to decide this ahead of time in order to be on the same page in performance. In this section, Schubert has given us only a piano dynamic marking for all 3 parts. However, due to the conflict with doubling, we have to create a more complex musical solution. The vocalist must lead, pun intended, so I have suggested mezzo piano. The right hand of the piano normally would be louder than the left, but since it's in the exact same octave in range and is doubling note for note the vocalist, it must be 2 dynamic levels quieter, which is where I came up with pianissimo. In this case, the left hand of the piano is louder than the right, since we have to have a middle ground somewhere, but it should still be less than the vocalist. We then get 3 dynamic levels of sound at the exact same time, but they're all generally centered around the piano dynamic that Schubert has given us. This way, we have the same mood, but better balance. I have omitted the vocal part in the next example in order to more clearly hear the dynamic distinction of the right and the left hand of the piano.
The same principle applies when you're doubling somebody 1 or more octaves apart in range. However, you can generally get away with only 1 dynamic level less, since the range itself partially takes care of the pitch overlap problem.
Here is another lead by Schubert that has a little bit more complicated counterpoint. I have suggested mezzo forte in the vocal part, and since it's doubled an octave lower, it normally wouldn't have to have quite as much separation in dynamics. However, in this case, I have said pianissimo in the doubling. Since there's 4 other lines and there's just so much going on, it's hard to hear it all. In this case, it's better to get the doubled line out of the way as much as possible, and then when it comes in again without the vocalist, you can really lean into it to show the repetition. Anything I have circled in this example is essentially important material, and that's what you should shift back and forth in hearing.
There is one more situation where a pianist is harmonizing, usually in intervals of thirds or sixths, instead of doubling a soloist's part. In this case, there are two things to consider.
If the harmonization is written above the soloist's range, it is best to play one or two dynamic levels quieter, since high pitches tend to be the most prominent in ensembles. If, however, the harmonization is written underneath, it is fine to match the dynamic of the soloist, since the pitch distinction functions as a supporting color. This is an example where the piano is harmonizing the voice by more than an octave, in this case a tenth, and that distance allows for the piano to sing out a little louder than normal. So despite Schubert's marking of pianissimo, I suggest a piano dynamic for the notes that are actually harmonized, which I have circled. After that, however, it's good to go back to pianissimo so that all the figuration work doesn't get in the way. The following example will do that, but if you notice, I'm not just playing louder on the 2 or 3 notes that are harmonized, but also I'm doing a slight crescendo into it as well as a decrescendo out of it. This makes for a more organic transition and doesn't sound like you're just accenting notes out of nowhere.
The idea that you should play louder when you're underneath a soloist and quieter when you're above them in range is not limited to just harmonization. In fact, it applies to almost any musical texture.
Mozart's Flute Concerto in G major provides an example where the orchestra, or in this case the piano, is harmonizing the melody both beneath and above. As you can see, the flute is playing repeated notes on D, which is right in the middle of the piano B and G. As a result, I have suggested mezzo piano for the bottom voice of the right hand and pianissimo for the top voice. That way, we get a good warmth of the harmony and we don't overshadow the flute above its range. Here is a recording of the orchestral part played on its own in order to hear each line clearly. And now with the flute part added in order to hear the balance between them.
An accompanist often has the role of providing the harmonic support of a piece, since most solo instruments can only play one note at a time and thus cannot produce harmony on their own. Because of this, it is very important to always be aware of harmonic function in your playing. There are a few tricks that can help with this. First of all, know that every chord has a root note that all other pitches spring from.
If each one of these half notes represents the root of a chord, then these would be the thirds, these the fifths, the sevenths, the ninths, the 11ths, and finally the 13ths. Each of these branches require a unique musical detail in order to function properly within their chord. The following chart covers the basics. The root of a harmony is its foundation. It should be played strong without being brought out. The third is the richest harmonic pitch of a chord since it determines major or minor. Therefore, you should lean into it gently to give it this feeling. The fifth tends to be the most nasal or vertical sounding, so you should often play it as quiet as possible to get it out of the way. The seventh often resolves stepwise to the chord that comes after it, so you should lean into it gently to feel its harmonic pull without giving it a lot of volume. Ninths, 11ths, and 13ths are all extensions of the primary harmony. They don't need attention to be drawn to them unless they have good voice leading into something that comes after them or that led into them. They provide plenty of color just by being there. The first page of Shostakovich's Cello Sonata is a great example of when the piano is doing nothing but broken chord figurations. It's important at these times to be aware of each harmony individually and where the root, third, fifth, and seventh of each chord is. Also, analyzing non-harmonic tones can be helpful. Particularly pay attention to having rich thirds and very soft fifths relative to each chord. This will give you the most round and beautiful harmonic support for the cellist. The danger of this, however, is that emphasizing any one detail about harmony too much can break up the constant flow of the texture in the writing. So my advice is to over-exaggerate it in practice just to be aware and condition your ear to the harmony, but then don't worry about it too much in performance.
While I personally recommend playing every note of the score, this is not always possible. Orchestral reductions especially are notoriously challenging for even the most advanced pianists. Because of this, it's important to make logical cuts and simplifications. When doing so, however, you have to keep the effect of the music intact without changing the score altogether. Here are a few guidelines to do so.
There are three fundamentals that need to remain intact at all times. The melody, since it's the part that most people remember, the bass line, since it determines the harmonic motion, and the rhythmic drive, with things like ostinati and primary beat arrivals, since those are the things that often keep a piece moving forward. Never leave out an iconic theme or a recognizable motive. Instead, you should save your reductions for counterpoint material, unless it's a Baroque piece or something highly imitative. This excerpt from Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 combines both of these principles together. As you can see, the right hand, playing the violins, is the main motive, whereas the left hand really is just counterpoint that's totally unnecessary because it's the same rhythmic structure, and leaving it out doesn't change the harmony, or the support, or the main drive of the piece. In fact, in this first recording where I do include it, you'll hear that it's more cluttered than the one that follows without it. If you are having trouble playing perpetually rapid figurations, first try eliminating just one or two notes around the treble spots. If that doesn't work, leave every other note of the passage out. And if it's still too hard, play only the downbeats of the passage and punctuate them clearly to help keep your soloist on the beat. Tremolos can often be replaced with repeated note blocked intervals played at half speed. The next example will show this. For pianists who struggle with tremolos, the repeated notes will do. Both of these figurations sound very similar since tremolos naturally get a repeated note sound with emphasis on the beat. However, the one challenge is that some pianists find bouncing the wrist more challenging than rotating it. So for them, it's better to just put in the work and keep the tremolo. If you do choose the repeated note version though, a light bit of pedal will help fill some of the space. You can often leave harmonizations of the orchestral writing itself out, as long as you leave enough support of the soloist intact. The same can be said for many filler notes, as long as the rhythm and structure of the harmony is still there. Here we have an example from Haydn's Trumpet Concerto, where both of those principles apply. First of all, the repeated notes are just filler, since they're the same pitch and ultimately the rhythmic structure is just waiting until the melody changes. So I've suggested to take them out entirely by marking an X. The circles indicate that you don't need to play both eighth notes. Instead, play the notes as a dyad and just make it a quarter note to match the right hand. This keeps the inversion of the harmony and the melodic and rhythmic structure intact, while simplifying the counterpoint, making it easier to play. Doublings of the soloist can be left out since you generally want them to be heard over you anyway. Measure 75 of the same Haydn concerto doubles the trumpet with the top of the right hand in the piano. This can't be left out since it's a different rhythmic structure, but it should be played pianissimo as to not get in the way. However, in measure 76, the piano simply doubles the trumpet and therefore can be left out altogether. This would ensure good balance between the parts, as well as make the counterpoint easier for the pianist to play. Many pianists struggle to play large chords that are so common in orchestral reductions, especially when they reach over an octave. Often you don't have to play every single note. You can simplify them by rolling them or leaving a few pitches out here and there, as long as you don't fundamentally change the structure of the voicing. Most double note passages can passably be performed with only one of the two lines present, or with one part held or simplified with the other playing as written. It's best to keep the top line intact by cutting the bottom notes out, unless that's a doubling of the soloist. Then it's acceptable to keep only the bottom line fully intact. This also applies to octave passages. At full tempo, the finale of Vaughan Williams's tuba concerto is nearly impossible to play with all of its double sixths and thirds that precede it. There are many valid solutions to getting around this problem, but the one I have suggested shows the top line remaining intact the whole time, and the bottom line only removing notes on the offbeat so as not to distort the rhythmic integrity. Since it's physically impossible to connect beat 3 of the poco animato in either voice, I actually switch them so that the C in the thumb connects to the fourth finger D flat right after it. This way, even though the top line temporarily breaks for 1/8 note, the bottom line of the right hand still covers the gap. All of these left out or shortened notes are hardly noticeable at a high speed with a little bit of pedal. Octave passages, like this one from Brahms' Violin Concerto, can often be handled the same way. Again, X's demonstrate what I am leaving out. The way I chose this, especially in the second line, is generally when one hand has an accent. That way the extra volume of the left hand will cover the dropped out note of the right hand, or vice versa. The repeated note Ds that I circled in measures 3 and 4 can also be left out since they're already present in the top line and you would still be left with 4 voices. This helps reduce the verticality of the passage since you don't have the stretch of the thumb to all the moving notes, so you can just simply use 4, 3, 2, 1 for the fingering. While one hand has an extended period of rests, you can bring it to the other hand to help out. This also keeps your body more centered and balanced, since it helps you to avoid leaning all of your weight into one side. Later in the same concerto, we see a great example of this, where the right hand can be used to aid the left hand's tonal and dynamic control.
There's a very common issue that occurs in almost every piece of music that's related to rhythmic counterpoint, melodic shaping, and balance. Essentially, it's this. When a soloist has a long, sustained note, any material that you have underneath it or during that has to be tailored down and played quieter so that you don't cover up the sustained note.
There's a great example of this in Saint-Saëns' Clarinet Sonata in E-flat. Notice that the clarinet is holding its sustained note for 4/8 note beats, whereas the piano is covering that with 3 notes and a dyad at the end. Although Saint-Saëns has given us only a piano dynamic, I have decided to add a diminuendo to a pianissimo in the piano. And if your clarinetist is open to taking suggestions, you could ask them to crescendo a little bit to help you out. The hairpin dynamics in the second line pose the same problem as the 4 measures before. However, since Saint-Saëns specifically requested them, you can't ignore them entirely. To get over this problem, I have suggested molto in the clarinet part and poco in the piano part, so you keep his intentions in mind while still having good balance. I have decided to use an excerpt from this recording since both of the performers provide an example that is relatively close to what I'm addressing.
Dragging, rushing, or using excessive rubato can all make coordinating rhythm with your soloist incredibly difficult. Pianists especially struggle with these issues in accompanying since they're so used to performing solo all the time, where they have a lot more leeway. However, always creating a forward-moving rhythmic drive is essential in every piece of music. In order to make this drive more effective, consider the following guidelines.
First, determine whether your left hand, right hand, or soloist part has the most rhythmically active material. Then think about how your shaping, articulation, and tempo all relate to that material. Next, find small and large-scale points of arrival of the phrase structure and form. Place surges that draw you toward these arrivals. In order to do so, practice a lot with the metronome and exaggerate your dynamics.
The last general concept to address is pedaling. This, however, is an art in and of itself that would require a tutorial of its own to properly dive into. For now, keep the following 2 things in mind.
Number 1, the fact that the pedal accumulates volume very quickly, so while you may need sonority to support your instrumentalist, be careful not to become too loud while doing so. And number 2, accompanying requires more frequent changes of pedal than any other style of piano playing, since textures frequently need to be sparse to allow the light of the soloist to shine through.
Be careful not to turn the ideas of this video into theories rather than realities. Nothing can replace your ear in terms of issues of collaboration, since in the end, music is performed, not described. Never cover up or outshine your soloist. Instead, let everything you do be in service to your equal musical partner. The art of accompanying is a complex field that requires years of experience and study to master. This video is in no way intended to be a comprehensive view on the subject. Instead, I mean for it only to be a few things that you can use to reliably improve your collaborations with other people. If you have any questions about the content in this video, or if you're interested in taking piano lessons with me in person or online, feel free to contact me either in the comments below or in all the information I have in the description.
If this tutorial was helpful for you, please consider supporting me through my new Patreon account. Your donation will help keep my content coming regularly, since videos like these are done only in my spare time and they require around 50 hours of prep. A link is provided in the description below.
Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.